All right, it is, according to my time, 11 o'clock. So 11 o'clock Pacific. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are located in the world. We welcome you to we hope to be an ongoing Church of Light event where we assist and help ask questions and give an overview, if you will, of some of the curriculum that's associated with the Church of Light. So I do encourage you to raise your hand. There's the ability to do that, or use the chat box. What we're going to do today is Vega is going to be sharing the opening ceremony. We're going to talk about the reasoning for course study, and I'm going to give use an example of the onion, how to approach this material and really work through it in a systematic way that really makes sense. I'm going to then talk about the key concepts, some of the key concepts of course one, and things to pay attention to. What could be a distraction? Because many times within the book, it's easy to get off on a tangent and miss some of the key characteristics and examples that need to be given. We will then have the closing ceremony and a question and answer time. Let's talk a little bit about the reasoning for study of this course. I'm going to call on Mark Doubleday. And Mark, tell me why you pursued this avenue of material rather than the myriad of other courses and information that's out there.
You and I've discussed it privately before. I started over 30-something years ago down this path, very hesitant because of my previous upbringing in the Christian church as a Protestant and whatnot, had a lot of misgivings, but I kept being driven this direction. So under the guise of studying history and philosophy, I eventually ran out of ways to turn. I kept getting pushed to studying astrology, and it became 10 years ago a very, very big push that direction. And I had really avoided it for a number of years. But the primary reason that I started down the path, I wasn't satisfied with the answers I was getting in all of my studies, religious or otherwise, or philosophical. And the main question that kept coming up is, I needed to understand what universal law was, and that was what drove me this direction. And there was a lot of dark material out there during the 70s and the 80s and even into the 90s. The Aleister Crowley stuff completely turned me off. And a lot of it seemed to be towards a lot of selfish and self-centered kind of motivations behind learning occult. Through the process of going through a series of lectures with a brother that Alan and I both know, Albert Benjamin's name came up and the Church of Light came up, and I had seen the website before and immediately dismissed it because it said church. Didn't go any further down the road. And it wasn't until this lecture or a couple lectures from this gentleman that when I was taking notes, I revisited the website and went, aha. And has been the most complete and holistic series of books studying esoteric and hermetic philosophies that I've ever been able to find, all in one place. I read a lot of writers over the years, and some of them had some of Albert Benjamin's ideas, C.C. Zane's ideas, and but you could tell when they didn't, and they went off the path, and they just went off into the weeds. So that's what drove me. What was universal law, and how could I best understand it and apply it in my own life? It was a long path, and I had to overcome a lot of internal prejudices and some fear to finally sit down with the books and go with them open mind and open heart to get through them. It took me 3 years.
Yeah,
it was quite a process.
All right. Well, Mark, thank you so much for that. And note what he said here, that this course of study, and I truly believe this and have found it to be true as well, that it is a foundational approach and a complete approach, a systematic approach to this whole idea of Hermeticism or occultism or whatever terminology you want to use to help explain aspects of life that normally are not discussed or are discussed very vaguely and without the detail. I want to share an example of what I call the secret of the onion. When you take an onion and you slice it, it has many layers. I think most of us have experienced that you peel the layer of an onion and there's another layer below. I have seen and I see this course of material through the 21 different courses as being different layers of the onion. In and of themselves, they're incomplete, but a part of the whole solution. What happens when you get to the core of the onion is that you find the seed. You find that which can create new life and can grow. Once you complete the 21 volumes, and at times it is a very frustrating path, especially, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why, in terms of your own study and in terms of life's experiences. But once you actually get to that seed that can germinate, you then have the beginnings of life. You then have the beginnings to practice and understand. Have you reached perfection? Absolutely not, except maybe Peg and a few of the others. Right, Peg? So it's a matter that what we have here is a license to learn and a structure to learn from and with. And that's exciting because oftentimes I found myself drawn into studying this, studying that, totally disconnected and often in disagreement with each other. But here you have a complete approach that covers virtually all the aspects. And as we'll talk about today, just even in volume 1 and course number 1, that the foundation is being laid for the rest of the material that is to come. So while it is an arduous process and a sometimes seemingly endless process, once you get to the heart, once you complete the materials, you then have a systematic approach, and really you start lacking excuses to say, well, I don't understand why these things are happening in my life and how to address them in a positive way. So let me tell you a little bit about my bias, because everybody comes in with bias and perspective. I teach university psychology classes. I'm completing my doctorate right now. My psychological approach is more, if you will, Jungian, depth psychology, looking at the aspects of the soul, aspects of life in general, which is very consistent with what you'll see written about in these books. And as you start reading more of Jung or understanding Jung, you say, wow, obviously this is what he's referring to. But one thing to primarily remember is that Albert Benjamin was a man of his time. Today's works, for instance, were written between 1921 and 1924 in the first 4 chapters. They were updated through his life. But again, the examples he uses, even the language he uses, is very reflective of a person of his time. Consequently, the gender-specific pronouns, languaging that's used may seem a little archaic or maybe even discriminatory, but he was a man of his time. Understand that, take that into consideration. Also, before you begin the study each day, one of the things that I encourage is that you sit down, center yourself, and prepare to open your mind. It's amazing that when I found that I rushed through or just grabbed and tried to read without really having that internal focus, I didn't gain as much from it and often had to go back and reread it. Also, I want you to note the date of each chapter before you begin. The way the material is structured today, and this is going to be changing in format in the future, but you'll note that Albert Benjamin actually gave the date that the initial material was written. Because what you want to know is what was occurring in the world at that time. And that historical perspective also may give you additional insight as to some of the languaging and some of the things that actually that he brings up. When I started to look at the material from even a historical perspective, of what was happening between 1921 and 1924. The Depression, beginnings of, in Europe, of the changing governments, revolution, all of these things add to, I think, the meaning of the material. The next thing I encourage is a review of the study questions with each chapter before you begin to read, to see what information is important to remember. Now, again, this may not be the information that is even of your personal interest, but it starts to broaden your perspective, helps you also with the tests that you receive and with the additional reading material. The next thing, and I tell my students all this, read the bold sections in the first paragraph of each paragraph within the chapter for context. That is a critical element. You will want to read the whole thing, but just going through it the first time and understanding, well, what's he going to be talking about? What are the areas that will be covered in the material for that day? And then start at the beginning and read through the chapter, noting the answers to the study questions as you go along. Now, I physically have the study guides. I'm still one of those people that likes to have books because I take notes in the margins and do all these things. But however you do it, whether it's electronic, whether it is getting the study guides themselves, highlight, makes notes, or whatever methods work for you in terms of identifying information that you may want to refer back to, or that you found interesting or curious, or that you may, again, want to ask questions of someone else. One of the other things that I would encourage, though it's not often logistically possible, at least in person, is to find someone to study with. Mark and I went through this, both of us had gone about halfway through the material and felt like we'd hit a wall. As we were able to study together, we helped each other. He understood things that just seemed oblivious to me. I understood some things that were a challenge for him. And by sharing together, we kept ourselves on course. One of the things that's recommended, and I found to be very helpful, was to begin the study of a course, one of the books, at the beginning of each new moon. Why? Well, new moon, as you will learn in the materials, is a time of new beginnings. It also helps you keep on track. So if you can begin a course at the beginning of each new moon, about a 2.5 to 3 year period. And some of these materials, especially like course 10, get to be quite complex, and then there's 2 volumes, and you may spend a month on each volume or more. As long as you have if you will, a guide in terms of encouraging you to set the time aside and to study the materials, you're more likely to be successful and keep yourself structured in how you do. So with that in mind, let's take a look at some of the key concepts within the material. And again, as I say, what I did is I actually went through the book. I would dog ear, which you're never supposed to do in a book. I would make notes. I would look at the highlighted chapters. And when you see something bolded here, that means that is a if you will, a paragraph heading that gives a line of thought that I think is very critical to understand, and is consistent also with the questions you find in the back of the material. So in chapter 1, occult data, that first item, man fears what he does not understand. I don't think I can state that any better. And there was a question, will I send copies of the screen of the presentation? It will be made available through the Church of Light after the presentation, along with the video itself. So thank you for asking. So man fears what he does not understand. And I think that's an innate part of us. And that goes together with that second point, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The one way that we experience the various concepts that are expressed in here is by evaluating them for ourselves rather than just what we are told or what others want. So it is a critical part that there is practical application of the various concepts and precepts that are presented within the books. Mark and I have together watched one gentleman that has a YouTube channel. And he is a scientist that deals with weather and the effects of the sun, the planets, geomagnetism, virtually all of the context that you will read about in the books, and how it affects the earth and how it affects individuals. He doesn't refer to this outside of a scientific perspective, but he puts into practical applications virtually all the materials that we learn in the book. So many people will discount for all astrology per se, but they have not themselves looked at it and examined it closely or in a way that applies to them. So they're discounting it because other people tell them that it is not a valid science. That is rapidly diminished once you experience it yourself and start to see the value of it. But that's kind of getting ahead of ourselves. Chapter 2, Astral Substance. One thing that was happening very much in the 1920s was Einstein's theory of relativity and special theory of relativity. On pages 28 through 30, you'll see the application of what happens to matter, what happens to energy, both within our realm, and then once we step outside into what later or now is called quantum physics. And even though these terms were not commonly used and not even mentioned per se as such within Albert Benjamin's material here, it is a direct correlation of what science is now understanding of the role of what we call the astral plane, and how the speed of light and various other Newtonian limitations and restrictions do not apply, and how thought, which has been an age-old concept held for thousands or for millennia by the ancients, that thought is an energy that creates and changes things and impacts life. Just as the effects of electromagnetism on page 28, that is a concept that will be greatly expanded in later coursework. So I always highlight that because electromagnetism is a foundational thing that affects how we feel, how we act, the weather. They're now even finding that the electromagnetism based upon energy from the sun is impact, along with the weather low fronts, impacts the creation of earthquakes or the triggering of earthquakes. So these materials that were pulled together within what's now the Church of Light and based upon what the ancients knew are being shown and being proven by science. And that really comes down to that all things have an astral counterpart. One of the Hermetic foundational studies was as above, so below, and part of our symbol. And we see that we are often a reflection of what is that in the world above. The other key that's in pages 32 to 33, and you should read those closely. Pages 33 and 34, anything once known is never forgotten. This is something that to me was just a revelation. I always knew, and in study of psychology, knew that there was a thought, or let's say a theory of universal truth or universal knowledge, but never had a way to actually put it in an understandable and usable form. This is the foundation, that once something's experienced by anyone, it is addressable and accessible by everyone if you know how and you're willing to put the work in. Is it foolproof? And this is one of the things that is also talked about continually through the materials. Albert did not consider himself foolproof, or if you would, everything that he said was absolutely true, because he challenges us to really go through and say, I've got to evaluate that for myself. And that is the encouragement to be a, if you will, an intelligent person, a person that does not accept on face value until they have done the research themselves and proven things to be true. This is one area, particularly in some of the later courses, that you will find to be foundational and very informative. Also, man is influenced equally by two environments. There is what we see as the world around us, and what we have is in terms of the astral objects and the world of thought and this other universe that exists. Maybe this is explained by dimensional aspects. The jury is still out in terms of scientifically what labels were going to be put on this. But we know that what affects us is not just that environment here, but also all the planets, all the astral objects in the sky through a myriad of various events, as well as that astral plane, which there'll be several courses that will study that and examine it in much more detail. You know, and Nancy was asking the question, does that include things learned or known in past lives? That's an interesting area that is still being examined. And I would tentatively say my belief is yes, but remember, everything that I say here today is my own opinion and my interpretation, and not necessarily that of the Church of Light. We all have our perspectives and our biases that we approach this material with. I would tend to say yes. Now, it's interesting because the Church of Light does not promote or operate under the assumption that there is reincarnation. There is a different explanation that is gone through in detail in a later course. So I'm probably going to ask you to hold that and wait and see. Yes, that's correct. Eric says that he doesn't believe in reincarnation. And that, yes, just like I said, there's an alternative theory that's put forth that you will find to be very fascinating. In chapter 3, this is some of the most important material in the book that will be referenced again and again and again. The nature of planetary influences. Now, one of the things that is a somewhat confusing to people is that when we talk about planets in terms of astrology, we're talking really about astral objects. So that could, we know the sun is not a planet. We know the moon is not a planet, but yet for, if you will, for descriptive purposes, everything is referred to as a planetary objects in the material. So that's just one of those things that you understand and accept and kind of move forward with. Many individuals dealing with astrology and with the tarot and others have discontinued the word planetary and used astral objects instead. But again, it's whatever you're comfortable with. On pages 54 and 55 in the study guide, and this may be different if you're doing the electronic version, but it's under that heading of planetary influences. There is an actual list of each of the astral objects and talking about their influence, talking about the musical note, the vibration that they represent, and the color of the spectrum that they represent. Commit that information to memory. The sooner you do, the more that you will gain from this. And it is something that, again, will be reinforced, particularly in book 10. You'll see, or course 10, which is 2 volumes, you'll see a dramatic expansion on all those things. Also, signs act as sounding boards. So we talk about how the signs themselves, question on higher octaves, that the signs themselves are represented as our houses in terms of volume and show the departments of life affected. What they're referring to when we talk about that the what we'll call the slow moving or the outer planets are, gosh, how do you term that? Our higher octaves, is that there are representations of base emotions, of influences, and, if you will, the way that they impact us. And between the inner planets and the outer planets, there's very much of a connection, particularly between certain ones. And this is explained more in book 10. Right now, just take that one, underline it, note it, saying, wow, I want to know more information about that, and it will come. Probably one of the most, I personally found a frustrating thing is I'm still influenced by the I want it now philosophy of our society. And deferred gratification, as it's technically called, is an aspect of our being that is not something that we like, enjoy, or want, but in many ways, making note of the questions that are important and finding out where these are more information is given is something that is going to be important. Now, after you get out of course number 1, and there's some references here in course 1, but particularly starting in course 2 and beyond, you will see that when he has a concept, that he will actually make reference that in course 5 or in course 10 or in whatever course, that he will explain more. Now, that does not mean that you should jump ahead. Matter of fact, I discourage that personally. It's one of those things, learn the foundation, grasp the concepts that are presented, and note the questions that you have. Because if you start jumping ahead, you may miss some important foundational material. I believe in, and Peg, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but still, for instance, the course on the Tarot is one of the most popular, as is course 10 in the 2 volumes in terms of astrology. However, without the foundation of books, for instance, 1 through 9, you miss out on a significant part of the meaning and the impact of what the later volumes talk about. Aspects, which is when we have various planets or astral objects that are in relationship, angular relationship to each other, indicate fortune or misfortune, is further explained in later volumes. Again, I would just make note of that, pages 56 through 59. I would not get into too much of the hows and whys yet, and to wait, digest, and have a little bit further understanding of what's represented here. Chapter 4, the concept of the way that we are constructed and the way that thought works is well explained, or at least is beginning to be explained in pages 66 through 69. The concept of stellar cells and structures. And again, this relates to as above, so below. And that we see that in the one paragraphs, that the birth chart accurately maps the character as it's been built up to the moment of birth in pages 73 and 74. This is another important concept. And you might say, well, when does birth occur? And this is somewhat debatable, but usually, and in my understanding, a birth occurs when the baby takes its first breath. That then would say that while there may be impact with a cesarean or with other, shall we say, non-natural forms of birth, when that baby takes the first breath, that is, in my feeling, why that can be so important. Volume just means intensity. Nancy asked a question, what is volume referring to in the house influences? So what it's talking about is the area that is affected and possibly the impact. We also have something that later on you'll learn is astrodynes, which is fairly unique to the Church of Light and to Benjamin's approach, that most people don't do because it is fairly complex. but we're fortunate in that we have a computer program that assists with that. But again, going to do some deferred gratification here for you and say that you will learn a lot more about that in book 10 and a little bit before and certainly afterwards. Now, progressed aspects, once you're born, the stellar alignments that happen there change as we age. Foundationally, you are who you are when you're born, but as we age, life impacts us. So one of the things that's very important to remember is that that we are not predestined to become for a certain outcome. That there are influences that impact us, much as the tides of the earth. If you've ever been out in the ocean, or you've been in the water and the tides coming in or going out, you have the creation of rip currents and other events. This is indicative of what happens with these stellar influences. Can you escape a rip current? Absolutely. You don't swim against it, you swim parallel to it until you get out of that pull or that push, depending on which direction it is. This is part of the system we learn is, let's say that there's these very negative influences that are coming or are impacting your life today. You learn some methodology and an approach of how to either enhance a good or to, if you will, negate or counter any negative effects or things that are not helpful. Is it 100%? I don't know. I found it to be very effective. And the term that we call it is dealing with, oh boy, Mark, help me. When we're correcting an event, I'm pulling up a blank here. We call it spiritual.
It's a process of spiritual alchemy.
Spiritual alchemy, boy.
And there's there's specific names that he uses for it.
Thank you.
Gosh,
yeah. That's okay, because this is obviously the effective age. Spiritual alchemy is a very important concept that you will learn in terms of how to manage your life. And the other thing that Zane points out, and I 100% believe this, is no longer do you have an excuse if your life is going the way it is, because you have the power to change it. It is not predestined. So much like for those who enjoyed the movies The Matrix, you take that one pill, no longer can you say you don't know, because you do know, and the excuses are removed. On page 80 is a very good outline in the last page of chapter 4 of what a complete reading of a birth chart is. And I am just astounded at how many people, many who have done astrology for years, do not take that into full account and effect. Just to give you some idea, what it talks about, the person receiving the chart should be told what it represents. Well, that's logical. He, and of course, this is a generic he or she should be told in connection with each department of life what will be attracted and why if nothing special is done about it. And what and why if nothing special is done about it. He should be informed as to the best methods to follow the destiny of each department of life in the desired direction. He should be told what a progressed aspect represents. He should be told what events each progressed aspect during the period covered may be expected to attract if nothing special is done about it. In connection with each progressed aspect during the period covered, he should be told the best methods of causing the energies that then present to attract not what they otherwise would, but what he desires. And then number 7, to show that the basis for such information is at hand, he should be given an accurately erected chart at the time of the day of birth. Taking into account daylight savings time. That's one thing that's really important, and sometimes is often missed. So anyway, now here is a personal consideration. I think chapters 5 through 7 can be a distraction. Now, that's not saying the material there is not important. It is important, but it will be greatly expanded upon in the later volumes and later courses. What I have seen happen, and I myself was subject to this, is in chapters 5 through 7, which talks about mediumship, it talks about ESP, it talks about a number of psychokinesis, a number of other topics, is they often can draw our attention so much that we negate or do not put the emphasis on the first 4 chapters, which really are, shall we say, foundational and will be other. Yes, book 3 in spiritual alchemy does go into that in terms of what we can do to correct and erect. That's why, again, I think it's important, if you will, to take the courses in order rather than jumping around. You have the opportunity to engage and get full benefit. However, it will at times be frustrating because you will develop a book of questions, not just a list, but likely a full book of questions that you'll say, oh my gosh, there's so much that I want to know. Slowly but surely, as you progress, those questions will be addressed. At the end, you may find some of them still are not addressed. And the one thing that the books do not do is they do not give you 100% of the answers. What they do is give you the foundation for exploration so that you have the framework to be able to go out and come to an understanding, come to that base of knowledge so that you can move forward and be able to, in a logical, sequential way, examine the questions that you have in life, impacts of people, places, and things. Look out and know when to look out for those solar or those planetary influences that have been impacting you in both a positive and a negative way. One interesting example is, and this is kind of a lesson to be learned, is that we have been experiencing a very low period of solar activity in terms of sunspots. What happens when we don't have sunspots is that there then is the magnetic field of the Earth, the Van Allen belt, the upper levels of the atmosphere are not electrically charged. Consequently, cosmic radiation is allowed to pour in. The interesting thing is, every time these solar events occurred, and we had one this last week, not this week, but the end of the prior week and the beginning of this week, is that in my chart, I was able to see this concurrent event happening. And it gave me the ability to protect, because I've had some health issues and I am learning what external events can impact that in the external environment. And these materials have given me, along with other materials that you'll learn about out there, other indicators and keys, to give you the ability to be able to, if you will, go through that. So let me share something with you here. I'd like to do a poll. And so if you would answer these, and what we're going to do is these are anonymous. It will not identify who you are, but we're interested in your information here in terms of kind of who you are, your interest, where you are, and how that you would like to see this progress. Eric asking, what book does he address diet? You know, Eric, it is addressed in terms of food, but I'll have to look that up, and we'll have to get back to you on that one.
Alan?
Yes.
I think it's course 19, not the personal alchemy, but I'll look it up in a few minutes. And
okay. That's why we have a number of us on here. Also in the future, I may not be the primary presenter. We want to, depending on the subject matter, of the course, we want to be able to have, if you will, those who have the best experience and expertise to present. So we will try to fit in terms of whether you want to, so far it's like 100% want monthly, and we will go and try to do. Again, this is the first one we've done. We still are experimenting in terms of what format, what forms, how long. All of this information is going to be taken into consideration, and we're going to make adjustments accordingly. So the form, nothing is really fixed in stone here. We're just starting to engage in this material. In future courses, we will not have the introductory material. We will get into more detail of the chapters and content. Yeah, if you have problems with the submit button, yeah, we will figure that out as well. Sometimes the polls and everything are a little convoluted. All right, looks like pretty much everyone has completed that. I'm going to end polling, and I'm going to share the results just for information here. So it looks like in terms of new members, we've got 37%, not a member, 11. 26% of you want to begin studying the courses. 30% of you have already completed, are Hermeticians and have completed the 21 course, and 11% are just curious. In terms of how much, looks like monthly is the winner, though we did have one person suggest weekly. And in terms of expectation, people would like more. And we will do everything we can to meet your expectation on this. In terms of time frame, looks like the vast majority want to go within 1 hour. And we may have a time afterwards to satisfy those with 90 minutes and 2 hours. We'll try to figure out what works best. Yes, and in terms of medical astrology, there is a number of really good and renowned authors in that area, and that, well, when we, though they're not referred to in the book, when we go through and get to those points, we'll make reference to that. And Peg also said in course 21, the personal alchemy addresses diet for planetary conditions. Yeah, I remember it being, I just didn't remember which book. And that is a real good summary. And there's, all right. So in terms of questions, before we go to the closing ceremonies, I want to respect the time. Again, we'll move into the closing ceremony once there are no other questions.